chemical-laden sludge was swallowing the last flickers of life from the young wolf. But in its amber eyes there was no fear, only a silent, haunting question that froze Michael Hart's heart. Are you going to be on time? At 38, Michael Hart, a veteran rescue ranger at the edge of Yellowstone, lived his life by a clock that always seemed to run 7 minutes late. That was the exact margin of time that had cost him his son Noah in a mountain tragedy 3 years ago. Since then, Michael moved with a desperate clinical urgency, trying to outrun a debt to the universe he could never repay. Today, he wasn't just patrolling a scarred logging site. He was hunting for a chance at redemption. As he hung suspended over the treacherous, oil-slicked ravine, the ground beneath his boots crumbled. Below him, the wolf pup Ash was sinking. The thick, toxic mud of an illegal logging operation had turned a drainage ditch into a death trap. Every struggle only pulled the creature deeper into the black abyss. Michael could hear the heavy thud of machinery in the distance. The men responsible for this destruction were returning to bury their evidence, and they weren't expecting a witness. With his safety line fraying against the jagged rocks and the shadows of armed men moving through the tree line above, Michael reached out. One hand gripped the freezing earth, the other strained toward the dying predator. Not this time, he hissed through gritted teeth, his muscles screaming under the tension. I am not letting go. Could a man who failed to save his own son defeat both nature and human greed to protect a wild soul? If you believe in second chances and the power of the unspoken bond between man and beast, leave a like right now. Make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss the breathtaking moment of healing at the end of this journey. Have you ever struggled with the crushing weight of a what if, or a moment you arrived too late? Share your story and the city you're watching from in the comments below. Let's begin Michael and Ash's incredible fight for comments. Survival. The wheezing breath of the pup was a jagged rasp, mirroring the mechanical whine of the distant logging skidders. Michael's boots skidded on the oily slurry, his body weight shifting dangerously as he hammered a piton into the fractured shale. The mud acted like a living, suffocating force, a viscous hunger that craved to keep Ash beneath the surface. He bypassed the standard recovery winch. There was no time. He lashed his own tactical harness to the primary anchor, a gnarled pine root that groaned under the strain. Leaning backward into the void, Michael plunged his gloved hands into the icy, chemical-saturated muck. The stench of antifreeze and rotted pine needles stung his nostrils, yet he barely registered the pain. He maneuvered the rescue webbing beneath the wolf's ribcage, his knuckles scraping against buried rock. Each time the wolf twitched, Michael felt the ground beneath him subside further. The weight of the animal was negligible, but the suction of the ditch was relentless. He gritted his teeth, his jaw locking as he surged upward, muscles in his forearms bunching like steel cables. With a wet, sucking pop, the pup broke free from the mire. Michael collapsed backward, clutching the limp, mud-caked creature to his thermal vest. He didn't care about the stains or the filth. He only cared about the faint, rhythmic thrum against his own chest. The predator was no longer a symbol of nature's wild dominance. It was a fragile, shivering spark of life. And in that fleeting, muddy seconds of contact, Michael knew the boy he had lost would have wanted him to finish the work he'd started. The suction force required Michael to lean into the abyss, his body nearly horizontal over the precipice, testing the absolute tensile strength of the nylon rope. He felt the cold mud seeping through the layers of his tactical gear, bringing with it a numbing sensation that threatened to steal the dexterity from his fingers. He had to be precise. One wrong move, one sharp rock snagging the webbing, and they would both plummet. He switched his grip, focusing entirely on the mechanical advantage of the pulley system he had hurriedly assembled. The pup was no longer fighting. It was shutting down. Its movements had ceased, replaced by a terrifying rigidity. Michael knew the dangers of hypothermia in these conditions. The chemical exposure accelerated the drop in body temperature by threefold. He needed to exert maximum force without triggering a landslide of the brittle shale. He heard a snap above him, not the rope but the primary anchor point, the pine root settling deeper into the earth. It held. The strain was nearly unbearable, a silent, grinding pressure in his shoulders that felt as if his joints were pulling apart. He adjusted his stance, using his boots to leverage against a narrow ledge, the mud slipping and sliding with each movement. The pup was nearly at the edge, but the final pull required breaking the surface tension of the deep-seated sludge. It was a battle of physics against a biological imperative to survive. He reached down with his free hand, ignoring the freezing temperature, and cleared the muck from the creature's nostrils, feeling the desperate, shallow breaths. He knew that if he couldn't get the animal out in the next minute, the toxic fumes alone would induce terminal coma. He forced his legs to straighten, using every ounce of his remaining strength, pushing against the crushing weight of the earth. The pup's head emerged, caked in black sludge, eyes closed, seemingly lifeless. Michael pulled the creature onto the solid ground, the rope slackening instantly. He immediately began checking for vital signs, his breath catching in his throat. The pup was barely breathing, its heart rate dangerously low. He didn't have the luxury of time to think. He grabbed his thermal blanket, wrapping the creature tightly to protect it from the biting wind. He had to keep it alive until he reached the cabin. He looked down into the pit, then at the distant silhouette of the logging crew, realizing he had just placed a target on his own back. But for now, the only thing that mattered was the weak, struggling heart beating against his own, a desperate echo of a life he couldn't save, now finding a second chance. The battle was won, but the war for survival had just begun. He lifted the pup carefully, the mud dripping from its body, and began the arduous trek up the slippery ravine wall, each step a testament to his refusal to let another life slip away. He could feel the pup's coldness seeping into his own body, but he pressed on, driven by an almost manic need to reach the station. The mechanical whine of the logging machinery seemed to intensify, a reminder of the threat that was still out there. Michael didn't look back. He kept his eyes on the path, his mind racing through the medical protocols he needed to follow. He had to act fast, or the rescue would be for nothing. He knew the risks of entering the station with a wild animal, the possibility of it turning on him, but he saw the trust in the pup's closed eyes. He was taking a massive risk, both legally and physically, but it was a risk he was willing to take. He was no longer just a ranger. He was a guardian. The pup shifted slightly in his arms, a small, barely audible whimpering sound escaping its throat. It was a sign of life, a sign of hope. Michael felt a tear track through the mud on his face. He wouldn't let this one go. Not this time. He felt the adrenaline starting to fade, replaced by a bone-deep weariness, but he pushed past it. The distance to the station felt insurmountable, but he kept moving, one step, then another. He thought about the logging crew, wondering if they saw him, wondering if they were coming for him. He had to be prepared for anything. He tightened his grip on the pup, ensuring it was secure, and continued his slow, methodical climb. The wind picked up, bringing with it the smell of snow. He had to reach the station before the storm hit. He looked at the pup's face, tracing the silhouette of its ears against the white blanket. It was beautiful even in its broken state. He felt a profound sense of responsibility, a weight heavier than the mud he had just pulled it from. He was going to save this creature no matter what it took. The journey was not over, but the first step had been taken. He had fought the abyss, and he had won. Now the real fight would be to keep the life he had saved. The cabin was within sight, a small speck of civilization against the vast wilderness. He took a deep breath, the cold air stinging his lungs, and pushed forward the pup's faint heartbeat, a steady rhythm in his own chest. He knew the challenges ahead were immense, but he also knew that he was capable of facing them. He had already proven that. The mud of the ravine was behind him, but the challenges of the future were just beginning. He would be ready. The battle with the abyss was only the beginning. He felt a renewed sense of purpose, a fire burning within him that had been dormant for years. He was not just saving a wolf, he was saving himself. The pup's life was now intertwined with his own, a shared destiny forged in the mud and the silence of the wilderness. He was ready for whatever came next. He was Michael Hart, and he was not letting go. Station 47 had never felt this cramped or smelled this heavily of ozone and pine oil, the atmosphere thick with the impending winter storm outside. The cabin's single kerosene lamp cast long dancing shadows that seemed to mock Michael's frantic pace, amplifying the isolation of his position on the western edge of the park. Outside, the wind screamed through the ancient pines, a relentless barrage of ice and snow that threatened to buckle the very timbers of the structure. But inside, the only sound that mattered was the erratic, shallow rattling of the wolf. Pup's breathing. Michael Hart worked with the precision of a trauma surgeon, his movements stripped of hesitation, born from years of emergency response training, yet tainted by a frantic edge that he could not shake. He bypassed the administrative protocols prioritizing the creature's hypothermic shock over the standard logging site reports that lay neglected on his desk. His hands, usually steady as stone, trembled slightly as he began the meticulous process of decontamination, stripping the caustic, chemical-saturated mud from Ash's matted fur with warm, sterile saline solution. The stench of industrial solvents was overpowering, a toxic cocktail that had burned the pup's skin and eyes, requiring a delicate touch to avoid causing further damage. He used a specialized solvent to break down the hardened sludge around the creature's paws, the small bones, fragile beneath his fingers, a stark reminder of the vulnerability of the wildlife he was tasked to protect. The pup's eyelids fluttered, amber irises darting behind translucent films, a sign of flickering consciousness that Michael both feared and desperately hoped for. He prepared the IV drip, maneuvering the small needle into the dehydrated vein of the wolf's hind leg, watching with intense focus as the electrolyte solution began its slow journey into the small body. Every second counted. The combination of freezing temperatures and chemical toxicity was a race against time that Michael knew all too well. His mind drifted against his will to the hospital waiting room 3 years prior, the sterile white walls and the crushing silence of a decision made too late regarding his son Noah. He saw the same stillness in Ash, now the same terrifying proximity to the void, but unlike the permanent quiet of the mountain accident, this stillness was fighting back, a primal resilience that stirred something deep within Michael's fractured soul. He felt an intense, almost manic compulsion to bridge the gap, to undo the past by meticulously repairing the present, treating every breath the wolf took as a personal validation of his duty. He checked the pup's temperature again, still critical, barely hovering above the threshold of terminal hypothermia, and adjusted the makeshift heating blanket he had rigged from a car defroster and a thick wool sack. The cabin's wood stove roared, pouring out a dry, intense heat that contrasted sharply with the frigid air seeping through the gaps in the cabin walls, creating a microcosm of survival in the heart of the storm. He administered a low-dose antibiotic to combat the potential toxicity infection, monitoring the steady, albeit weak, rise and fall of the wolf's flank. Hour by hour, the pup's erratic shivering leveled off into a deep, recuperative sleep, a temporary truce in the battle against death. Michael couldn't afford to rest. He meticulously documented the pup's vital signs, noting the subtle improvements and the persistent danger of secondary organ damage caused by the ingested sludge. The silence of the cabin was heavy, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the howling gale outside, a stark reminder of the world's indifference to their small, desperate struggle. He thought about the men he had seen at the logging site, the cold, calculating greed that had put this animal in danger, and felt a surge of protective rage that sharpened his focus. This wolf was no longer just a subject of study. It was a symbol, a vulnerable life that had been spared by a twist of fate and was now under his personal guardianship. When Ash finally cracked an eye open, the gaze wasn't primal or predatory. It was curious, dazed, and intensely fragile, locking on to Michael with a strange, unspoken recognition. The pup's head shifted slightly, the amber eyes tracking Michael as he moved around the small cabin, a sign of cognitive function returning that brought a wave of relief so intense it left Michael dizzy. He held out a small strip of dried venison, his hand steady this time, offering it not as a trainer, but as a lifeline. The wolf hesitated, sniffed, and then tentatively accepted the offering, a profound, wordless treaty, signed between two broken spirits in the heart of the mountains. The sound of Ash chewing, however weakly, was the most beautiful thing Michael had heard in years, a tiny victory over the darkness that had haunted him since Noah's death. He watched the pup swallow, knowing that this simple act was a massive step toward recovery, a validation of the dangerous illegal risks he had taken to bring the animal here. He sat back in his chair, the adrenaline finally beginning to fade, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion. Yet he felt a strange, quiet sense of purpose he hadn't experienced in the 3 long years since the accident. He looked at the wolf now, resting its head on its paws, and knew that the battle was far from over, but for the first time, he felt they had a fighting chance. The storm would break, the sun would rise, and they would still be here, two survivors in the wilderness, bound by a shared traumatic, narrow escape. He meticulously cleaned the equipment, the routine of sterilization, providing a comforting structure to his thoughts, allowing him to process the emotional weight of the last 24 hours. He knew that the authorities would eventually investigate the logging site, and he would have to face the consequences of his actions, but he realized with sudden crystalline clarity that he didn't care. The life of this creature, the chance to mend a broken soul, was worth any price he might have to pay. He checked on Ash one last time, the pup's breathing, now steady and deep, the signs of caustic burns on its fur beginning to fade under the balm he had applied. Michael felt a tear track through the grime on his face, a silent acknowledgement of the pain he still carried, but also a recognition of the new, fragile hope that had taken root in his heart. The cabin was a sanctuary, a fragile bubble of warmth and life amidst the frozen, indifferent wilderness, and he would defend it with everything he had. He finally allowed himself to close his eyes, listening to the steady heartbeat of the wolf, a rhythm that was slowly syncing with his own, bringing a semblance of peace to the chaotic night. He knew he would wake up to a new set of challenges, to the reality of bringing a wild animal back to health, to the danger of the loggers, but he was prepared. He had faced the abyss and had found a reason to fight back, a small, amber-eyed reason that was currently sleeping in a corner of his cabin waiting for the dawn. He looked at the neglected reports on his desk, the bureaucratic nightmare of his job, and felt a sense of detachment, a realization that his true work was no longer on paper, but in the living, breathing reality of the forest. He would protect this wolf not just for the sake of the species, but for the sake of his own redemption, a desperate attempt to balance the scales of a life that had felt empty and purposeless for too long. The storm outside continued to rage, but inside the cabin the atmosphere had shifted from one of desperate panic to a quiet, determined watchfulness. He had saved the life. Now he had to save the spirit, to help this creature regain the wild strength it needed to survive in a world that was often hostile and cruel. He was not just a ranger anymore. He was a partner in survival, a guardian of a life that had been snatched from the jaws of death, and he was ready to face whatever came next, confident that they could overcome it together. He watched the firelight dance on the ceiling, the shadows now shorter, less menacing, a reflection of the hope that was slowly filling the cabin, warming the air, and giving him the strength to face the future. The silence of the cabin was now a shared space, a testament to the bond that was forming in the midst of the cold, a bond forged in the heat of a crisis and tempered by the quiet moments of care and recovery. He knew that Ash would never be a pet, that the wild was its home, but for now this small temporary truce allowed them both to heal, to find the strength to move forward, to survive the storm that was both outside and within them. When darkness swallowed Yellowstone, the most dangerous predators didn't prowl on four legs, but on two, clad in heavy-duty logger boots and carrying high-caliber rifles. Miller, a man with a face like crumpled cardboard and eyes devoid of empathy, led the crew toward the station with a purposeful, menacing stride that crushed the thin crust of snow beneath his feet. He wasn't there for the scenery. He was there for the drone he'd crashed near the drainage ditch, a device containing GPS coordinates of their illegal timber harvest that could send them all to federal prison for decades. They spotted the faint glow of the station's windows, a solitary beacon in the wilderness that represented the only obstacle between them and the destruction of evidence. Michael had disabled the external floodlights, keeping the cabin in a deceptive, hollow darkness, relying on the natural shadows of the dense forest to mask his presence. Miller signaled his men to fan out their heavy steps, crunching through the frozen crust of the snow, creating a rhythm of impending doom that echoed against the silent pines. They weren't just hunters. They were sanitizers, meticulously trained to remove any trace of their environmental crimes. Inside, Michael didn't reach for a weapon but for the radio handset, his fingers brushing the static-choked frequency of the emergency channel. The radio was dead, cut, a fact that spiked a jolt of adrenaline through his chest, replacing the exhaustion of the previous days with a sharp, desperate alertness. He looked at Ash, who was standing now, ears pricked toward the door, a low, barely audible vibration rumbling in its chest. the wolf's instinctive warning of impending violence. The silence of the forest was replaced by the aggressive, rhythmic thumping of boots on the wooden porch, a sound that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of Michael's bones. Michael realized the stakes had shifted dramatically. This wasn't just about preserving the local ecology or saving a single wounded animal anymore. It was a confrontation with the very forces that were dismantling the sanctity of the park, a test of his resolve to protect the silent victims of human greed. He moved to the rear window, his silhouette barely visible against the shadow-drenched interior, his breath hitching as he heard the lock on the front door groan under the pressure of a shoulder check, the metal protest echoing loudly in the enclosed space. Miller's voice, rough and authoritative, pierced the cold air outside, demanding that Michael open the door, his tone leaving no room for negotiation or rational discourse. Michael knew that if he surrendered Ash, the wolf would be killed to erase the forensic evidence of the chemical dumping, a final brutal act that would seal his failure to protect the wilderness he loved. He surveyed the cabin, checking the few tools he had available: a hunting knife, a heavy iron poker, a makeshift barricade he had reinforced earlier, and realized they were utterly inadequate against the firepower and numbers of the crew outside. Yet he felt a strange, calm detachment settle over him, a focus born from the understanding that he was standing in the gap between the defenseless and the destructive. The pressure on the door intensified, the wood beginning to splinter, a clear indication that time was running out, that the confrontation was inevitable. Michael knew he had to play the only card he had left: the unpredictability of the environment and his intimate knowledge of the surrounding terrain, a strategy that required nerves of steel and perfect timing. He took a deep breath, calming the tremors in his hands, and waited for the moment when the door would finally give way, prepared to turn his small, cramped cabin into a fortress against the encroaching darkness. He heard the muffled conversation of the men outside, the chilling precision of their movements, the utter lack of humanity in their approach, and felt a profound, unwavering conviction in his mission. This was no longer just his job. It was my purpose, a challenge that demanded everything he had to give a fight that he was now finally ready to win, regardless of the cost. The air in the cabin grew thick with tension, the silence between the thumps on the door feeling immense, a vacuum waiting to be filled with action, a decisive moment that would define the rest of his life. He looked at Ash one last time, seeing the same fierce, wild determination in the wolf's eyes, a shared recognition of the danger they were in, and knew that they were no longer just man and animal, but partners in a desperate, last-ditch battle for survival. The splintering of the door accelerated the final blow imminent, and Michael braced himself, his mind already calculating the next move, the next desperate necessary action in a fight that would not end until the darkness was defeated. The heavy boots of the men outside were not just a threat to his safety. They were a desecration of the natural order, a callous disregard for life that Michael was now determined to stop no matter what it took. He knew that the authorities wouldn't arrive in time, that the radio was useless, that he was utterly alone, yet he felt a strange empowerment, a realization that he had the power to protect the power, to stand, the power to fight for what was right. The door shivered, the hinge failing, and Miller's face, cold and calculating, appeared in the gap, a sight that should have brought terror, but instead brought a calm, focused resolve. The confrontation had begun not in a court of law or on a battlefield, but in the heart of the wilderness between one man, one wolf, and the encroaching darkness of greed and violence. Michael didn't back down. He stepped forward, meeting Miller's gaze with a steady, unbreakable defiance, prepared to defend his charge, his home, and the very spirit of the Yellowstone wilderness with his life. The tension was suffocating, the cold air rushing into the cabin, as the door finally gave way, a dramatic climax to the silent terror of the preceding moments, a beginning of a battle that would be fought in the shadows, and the light in the heart and the mind, a struggle for the soul of the forest itself. Miller stepped into the room, his men hovering behind him like shadows, the air filled with the smell of diesel and sweat, a stark contrast to the clean, pine-scented air of the mountains, a physical embodiment of the corruption they brought with them. Michael didn't speak. He just watched, his eyes scanning for any advantage, his body tense, prepared for the physical confrontation he knew was coming, a battle of strength and willpower that would be decided in the cramped, dimly lit cabin. The men were not just after the drone. They were after the evidence, the wolf, the truth, a truth that Michael was now committed to shielding no matter the consequences. He realized that this was not just a conflict over a piece of equipment. It was a fight for the future of the park, a battle that would determine whether the wilderness remained a sanctuary or became a dumping ground for the reckless greed of men like Miller. The silence that followed Miller's entrance was profound, a vacuum in which the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the heavy, deliberate breathing of the men, a moment of anticipation before the storm, a quiet that preceded the violence. Michael knew he had to be strategic, that a direct confrontation would be fatal, that he had to use the environment, the unexpected, the psychological, to fight back against the overwhelming odds, a plan that was as desperate as it was necessary. The wolf, Ash, moved slightly, a low growl, barely escaping its throat, a sound that made Miller freeze, his eyes shifting from Michael to the corner of the cabin where the pup was hidden in the shadows, a realization of the real threat, the real evidence, the real target. The tension spiked again, a new layer of danger added to the mix, a realization that the wolf was not just a tool but a sentient, dangerous, and loyal protector, a factor Miller had not fully accounted for in his calculations. Michael saw the shift in Miller's focus and knew he had to act, to distract, to move, to turn the situation around before it was too late. A moment of truth that would either lead to their survival or their demise. A decisive action that was required now. The cabin felt smaller, the walls closing in the air, heavy with the weight of the coming confrontation. A battle that would be decided not by strength alone, but by wit, courage, and the desperate, unwavering belief in the rightness of their cause. The men moved forward, their guns ready, their faces masked, a menacing presence that threatened to extinguish the light of hope, the light of protection, the light of life, a threat that Michael was prepared to stop no matter what it took. The struggle was imminent, a battle for the soul of Yellowstone. A conflict that would be remembered not for its violence, but for its courage, its defiance, its unwavering commitment to the natural world. The thick wooden door of the ranger station shuddered under the pressure of the heavy blows, yet inside Michael possessed only a half box of ammunition and an ironclad resolve that had been forged in the crucible of his own regret. He didn't fire. He manipulated. He yanked the lever on the fire suppression system, flooding the kitchen with a blinding white mist of chemical retardant that turned the cabin into a labyrinth of zero visibility. The sudden pressure wave sent Miller's men reeling back, their shouts of confusion echoing into the hall, a temporary disorientation that was exactly what Michael needed. In the chaos, Michael slipped through the pantry, his movement ghost-like, a shadow within shadows, knowing the layout of the station better than his own reflection. Ash, despite its lingering weakness, moved with fluid, instinctive silence, a phantom predator guiding him through the haze. The pup suddenly stiffened its lips, curling back to reveal needles of white teeth, and let out a guttural warning growl toward the mudroom, a sound that cut through the roaring wind and the shouts of the intruders. A shadow detached itself from the doorway, a man confused by the haze stepping into a trap. Michael didn't hesitate, using the layout of the room to blindside the intruder, his tactical training overriding the fear in his throat. It was a brutal, contained dance of survival in the dark. Every object in the room became a tool, every corner a vantage point. The struggle was defined by breath muscle and the metallic tang of fear. Ash lunged, not to kill but to distract, nipping at the heels of the invader, creating just enough hesitation for Michael to seize the upper hand. They were not just man and animal. They were a singular, unified force defending their territory. Michael used the chemical haze to maneuver behind a second intruder, applying a sleeper hold that silenced the man without a shot. Fired the sounds of the struggle absorbed by the thick, mist-filled air. The cabin was a pressure cooker of adrenaline and impending violence, a space where one wrong move meant death, where every instinct was honed to a razor's edge. Michael knew he couldn't hold out forever. His ammunition was almost gone, and Miller was likely waiting for the mist to clear to make a final, overwhelming push. He decided to turn the table, utilizing the station's intercom system to broadcast a distorted, terrifying roar that he hoped would mimic a larger, more dangerous predator, a gamble that required nerves of steel. The sound echoed through the mist, causing a momentary pause in the intruder's movements, a flicker of doubt that Michael capitalized on by repositioning himself near the cellar door. He heard the muffled voices of the men trying to communicate, their confidence wavering as the environment continued to work against them. Ash stayed by his side, its breathing heavy but its eyes sharp, a guardian in the darkness that was as much a part of the defense as Michael himself. The battle was not just against the men, but against the fear of failure, the fear of losing another life, the fear of repeating the mistakes of the past. Michael tightened his grip on the improvised weapon he had fashioned from a heavy metal pipe, his muscles aching but fueled by a desperate, unwavering purpose. The mist was beginning to clear, exposing the devastation they had inflicted on the kitchen, the splintered furniture, the shattered glass, a testament to the violence of the encounter. He knew the next few minutes would be the most critical, the moments when Miller would either break through or be forced to retreat. He looked at Ash, a fleeting moment of connection in the chaos, a shared understanding of the stakes, a silent promise to survive. The door to the mudroom groaned again, a clear sign that the final assault was about to begin, and Michael braced himself, prepared to fight for every inch of space, for every second of life, for the future of the wolf and his own. Redemption. The air was thick with the scent of chemicals, gunpowder, and the metallic tang of blood, a sensory overload that threatened to overwhelm his senses. But he pushed through it, driven by a primal need to protect, to survive, to prevail. He saw a silhouette moving toward the living room, a man who was likely the last one standing, and he prepared for the final decisive confrontation, a battle that would decide the fate of the station, the wolf and the man who had found a reason to live again. The tension was suffocating the silence between the heartbeats, feeling like an eternity, a moment of profound, terrifying clarity that forced him to accept the reality of the situation, the imminent possibility of his own death, and the desperate necessity of his actions. He was not just fighting for his life. He was fighting for the wolf, for the park, for the principle that the wilderness was not for sale, not for plunder, not for the greed of men like Miller. The silhouette came closer, a man who was now visibly shaken by the unconventional defense, his movements hesitant, his confidence broken, a man who had underestimated the Rangers' resolve. Michael stepped out from the shadows, the pipe held firm, a silent challenge that forced the intruder to stop, to reconsider, to feel the weight of his own actions. The confrontation was not just physical, it was psychological. A battle of wills that was slowly being won by the man who had nothing left to lose and everything to protect. The intruder hesitated, then slowly lowered his weapon, the realization of his situation, sinking in a moment of surrender that signaled the turning point in the battle. Michael didn't relax. He stayed vigilant, knowing that Miller was still out there, that the battle was not truly over until the threat was completely removed, a lesson he had learned in the most brutal way possible. He looked at Ash, who was now sitting calmly, its eyes watching the intruder with a mixture of suspicion and pride, a loyal guardian who had proven its worth in the crucible of battle. The battle had been won, but the war for the park, for the wilderness, was just beginning, a war that Michael was now prepared to fight, to win, to end. The silence that followed the surrender was profound, a vacuum in which the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the heavy, deliberate breathing of the men. A moment of anticipation before the storm, a quiet that preceded the violence. Michael knew he had to be strategic, that a direct confrontation would be fatal, that he had to use the environment, the unexpected, the psychological, to fight back against the overwhelming odds, a plan that was as desperate as it was necessary. The wolf Ash moved slightly, a low growl barely escaping its throat, a sound that made Miller freeze, his eyes shifting from Michael to the corner of the cabin where the pup was hidden in the shadows, a realization of the real threat, the real evidence, the real target. The tension spiked again, a new layer of danger added to the mix, a realization that the wolf was not just a tool, but a sentient, dangerous, and loyal protector, a factor Miller had not fully accounted for in his calculations. Michael saw the shift in Miller's focus and knew he had to act, to distract, to move, to turn the situation around before it was too late. A moment of truth that would either lead to their survival or their demise. A decisive action that was required now. The cabin felt smaller, the walls closing in the air, heavy with the weight of the coming confrontation, a battle that would be decided not by strength alone, but by wit, courage, and the desperate, unwavering belief in the rightness of their cause. The men moved forward, their guns ready, their faces masked, a menacing presence that threatened to extinguish the light of hope, the light of protection, the light of life. A threat that Michael was prepared to stop no matter what it took. The struggle was imminent, a battle for the soul of Yellowstone, a conflict that would be remembered not for its violence but for its courage, its defiance, its unwavering commitment to the natural world. The dawn of the fifth day arrived without the crack of gunfire, bringing instead the eerie, hollow silence of a battlefield that had finally ceased its hostility. A calm that seemed to hold its breath in the wake of the nocturnal storm. Miller and his associates had vanished into the tree line, the moment Michael triggered the high-frequency emergency beacon he'd rigged to the station's roof. A siren that signaled not to the police, but to the aerial surveillance patrol that monitored the park's perimeters, a desperate gamble that had paid off. The threat had dissolved like mountain fog under the relentless pressure of the approaching helicopters, leaving behind only the wreckage of the confrontation, the shattered door, the chemical mist, and the lingering metallic tang of fear. Now the station was a sanctuary once more, a quiet bubble of life amidst the vast, indifferent expanse of the Yellowstone wilderness, yet it felt fundamentally altered by the events that had transpired within its walls. Michael spent the following days tending to Ash's recovery, watching as the wolf's natural gait returned the limp from the drainage ditch, fading into a rhythmic, powerful stride that spoke of strength reclaiming its place in the creature's body. They moved through the daily motions with an unspoken understanding, a shared rhythm that transcended the boundaries of species, a partnership forged in the direst of circumstances. Michael no longer rushed his coffee, no longer checked his watch with frantic, anxious glances that spoke of a debt to time he was trying to repay. He learned to inhabit the moment, to breathe in the crisp mountain air, and to listen to the silent language of the forest. He observed the way the forest reclaimed the area around the cabin, watching the birds return to the eaves, the pine martens chattering in the rafters, a reassurance that the circle of life continued despite the human violence that had momentarily disrupted it. He realized that trust wasn't something earned through grand gestures or heroic acts, but through the quiet, consistent act of being present, of respecting boundaries, of offering care without demanding obedience. He saw it in the way Ash would nudge his hand with a cold, wet nose, a gesture that bridged the gap between species, a silent acknowledgement of the life they had shared, the mutual survival they had achieved. It was a mutual restoration. The man who had lost his purpose was finding it in the eyes of the creature he had pulled from the grave. A testament to the idea that some wounds do not heal with time alone, but with the active, deliberate choice to care, to mend, to protect. The cabin became a laboratory of healing not just for the wolf's physical injuries, but for Michael's scarred psyche. The daily routine of feeding, cleaning, and observing the wolf, providing a structured path toward recovery. He meticulously documented the progress in his logbook, the clinical notes, now interspersed with reflections on the profound intelligence and resilience of the creature, a shift from professional detachment to personal investment. The local ecosystem began to heal as well. The illegal logging site abandoned the chemical sludge slowly being diluted by the mountain snowmelt, a slow, natural reclamation that mirrored the recovery happening within the cabin walls. Michael spent hours watching Ash interact with the environment, observing the way the wolf tested its strength against the fallen logs, the way it sensed the changing weather, a lesson in adaptability and instinct that he had long ignored in his own life. The fear of Miller's return lingered a shadow in the corner of his mind, but it was overshadowed by the profound sense of accomplishment he felt in seeing the wolf thrive, in knowing that he had done something undeniably right in a world that often felt irredeemably wrong. He began to feel a sense of peace he hadn't known since before the accident, a quiet joy that stemmed from the simple act of watching life continue, of being part of a larger, interconnected web of existence, rather than an isolated observer of its destruction. The bond they formed was not one of master and pet, but of mutual respect between two beings who had faced the same abyss and had chosen together to walk away from it. Michael realized that the lessons he had learned from the forest, the necessity of patience, the importance of resilience, the power of trust, were applicable to his own human struggles, a realization that began to mend the fractured relationships in his life. He began to prepare for the inevitable return of the wolf to the wild, a process that was as difficult as it was necessary, a test of his dedication to the wolf's ultimate welfare over his own desire for companionship. The daily exercises became more strenuous, designed to test the wolf's agility and stamina, the recovery of its natural predatory instincts, a sign that it was ready for the life it was meant to live. Michael watched the wolf's amber eyes, seeing not just a rescued creature but a wild spirit that could not be contained, a reminder that true care sometimes means letting go, even when it hurts. He began to plan for the final act of the rescue, the return to the meadow, where it all began, a symbolic closure that would complete the journey they had shared, a final lesson in the true meaning of conservation. The silence of the cabin was no longer heavy but filled with a quiet sense of hope, a testament to the idea that even in the darkest of times light can be found and healing is possible, one small, quiet step at a time. The wolf's recovery was not just a medical success. It was a psychological triumph, a validation of the belief that nature, despite its brutality, holds the capacity for extraordinary restoration, if only we allow it. Michael's heart was changed, not by the confrontation, but by the quiet, sustained act of nurturing a man who had been broken by loss, now being remade by the profound, wordless bond with a creature of the wild. The sunrise was a new beginning, a promise of a future that was not defined by the past, but by the choices he would make today, a future that was wild, free, and deeply undeniably alive. He felt a profound gratitude for the challenges he had faced, for the opportunity to rediscover the beauty and resilience of the natural world, a journey that had led him to a place of peace, of understanding, of purpose. The forest whispered its secrets to him, a language he was finally learning to understand, a testament to the profound connection that exists between all living things, a connection he would spend the rest of his life protecting, honoring, and celebrating, a guardian of the wild. The iron crate sat open on the edge of the meadow, acting as the final permeable barrier between their deep-seated connection and the wild, untamed reality of the forest. Michael had spent weeks tracking the pack, verifying their location via the remote motion-activated cameras he'd set up along the game trails, meticulously analyzing the data to ensure the release would be successful. He knew the matriarch was close. He had seen her in the grain of the camera feeds, her golden gaze fixed toward the station, a silent, watchful presence that gave him hope. He approached the clearing with Ash at his heel, the wolf's movements cautious and deliberate, its ears flicking toward the distant sounds of the forest, a mixture of anticipation and anxiety in its body language. The air was crisp, scented with pine, and the metallic tang of approaching rain, a stark contrast to the sterile environment of the station. When the edge of the timberline finally yielded, the pack revealed itself a phalanx of gray and shadow against the evergreen, their presence a silent command that stopped Ash in its tracks. The alpha female emerged, her presence a silent command that stopped Ash in its tracks, her gaze intense and unwavering. The pup hesitated, its tail tucking, then flicking outward toward Michael, a profound, agonizing conflict visible in its eyes. There was a palpable pull of two different worlds, a gravity that tugged at the wolf's heart, a battle between the safety of the cabin and the freedom of the pack. Michael knelt his boots, digging into the damp earth, and waited, his heart pounding in his chest, a mixture of pride and profound sorrow washing over him. Ash closed the distance, the wolf's snout brushing against Michael's palm in a soft, dry friction, a final lingering acknowledgement of the life they had shared, the mutual trust they had built in the face of death. The pup turned its form, disappearing into the brush, and the mother with a single sharp look back at the ranger merged with the shadows. The meadow was empty, the silence absolute, and for the first time Michael felt the weight of the loss lift, replaced by the profound, quiet pride of a task completed. He stood up, his knees aching, and watched the tree line for a long moment. The silence of the meadow, a stark contrast to the tumultuous events of the past few weeks. He had prepared for this moment, yet it was more difficult than he had imagined, a profound severance of a bond that had been forged in the most intense circumstances. He knew that the wolf was where it belonged, but the absence felt vast, a void in his life that he would have to learn to fill with something other than the desperate need to protect. He began the slow walk back to his truck, the crunch of gravel under his boots, a reminder of his own world, a world that now seemed different, altered by the experience. He took one last look at the tree line, a silent farewell to the pup that had saved him as much as he had saved it, a partner in survival who was now truly free. The forest seemed to hold its breath, a silent witness to the profound act of letting go, a testament to the idea that true love sometimes requires the courage to say goodbye. Michael felt a sense of peace settle over him, a quiet assurance that he had done the right thing, that the wolf was safe, and that he himself was finally beginning to heal. He knew that he would never forget the amber eyes of the pup, the trust it had placed in him, the shared moments of survival that had changed them both forever. The drive back to the station was quiet, the only sound, the hum of the tires on the dirt road, a stark contrast to the roaring wind and the shouts of the intruders that had haunted the previous nights. He arrived at the station. The splintered door now repaired the station, a quiet, peaceful sanctuary once more, a place of healing, of reflection, of purpose. He entered the cabin, the silence profound, a stark reminder of the absence of the wolf, a space that was now his own again, yet felt fundamentally different, filled with the memories of the shared struggle and the eventual triumph of trust. He sat at his desk, the neglected reports still waiting for his attention, but they no longer seemed important. A testament to the shift in his priorities, the realization of what truly mattered in life. He looked at the logbook, the entries detailing the pup's recovery, a record of the journey they had shared, a testament to the resilience of life and the power of care. He knew that he would always be a ranger, that his duty was to protect the wilderness, but he now understood that this protection was not just about enforcing laws or managing resources, but about fostering a deeper, more empathetic connection with the natural world. He stepped out onto the porch, the air crisp and clean, the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky, a sense of wonder and awe filling him. The wilderness was vast, untamed, and indifferent, yet it was also a place of profound beauty, of resilience, of interconnected life, that he was privileged to witness, to protect, to be a part of. He felt a profound gratitude for the experience, for the lessons he had learned, for the bond he had shared with the wolf, a bond that would continue to resonate in his heart, a reminder of the power of connection in a world that often felt cold and disconnected. The meadow was empty, but the forest was alive, filled with the echoes of the wild, a testament to the enduring power of nature, a power that Michael was now committed to honoring, protecting, and celebrating, a guardian of the wild. Michael picked up the receiver of the landline, his fingers steady the tremor that had plagued him for 3 years, finally vanished as he dialed Sarah's number, the old device humming with a nostalgic static that mirrored the shaky bridge he was trying to rebuild. The conversation was sparse, stripped of the jagged edges of their past, a bridge built over the chasm of their shared grief. The silence between sentences filled not with agonizing awkwardness, but with a tentative, profound understanding. He spoke of the mountain of the change in the air, and for the first time he articulated the absolution he had found, not in forgetting Noah, but in protecting the living world, a confession that seemed to lift a physical weight from his shoulders. Sarah's voice, fragile, yet remarkably composed, expressed a cautious hope, an acknowledgement of the profound shift in his demeanor, a recognition that the man she once knew was finally emerging from the darkness of his own making. He realized that the past was a fixed point, an immovable stone, but the future was a river that still held the potential to flow, to change, to nourish, a realization that brought a tear to his eye, not of despair, but of profound gratitude for the second chance he had been given. Looking up toward the ridgetops, he caught the distant, mournful, and triumphant howl of Ash, a sound that echoed against the granite crags and seemed to vibrate in his very marrow, a sound of freedom, of resilience, of a life he had helped to save. He understood then that family was not solely defined by the people we lose, but by the lives we actively choose to protect, nurture, and set free. When the time is right, a profound epiphany that redefined his understanding of love, of duty, of connection. His life was no longer measured in the 7 minutes he had been late, but in the lifetime of moments he was now prepared to claim, to cherish, to protect, with a fierce, unwavering dedication. As the dusk deepened, painting the peaks in hues of bruised purple and gold, he realized the ultimate lesson to live is to be a guardian, a protector, a witness to the beauty and brutality of the natural world, a realization that brought a profound sense of purpose to his quiet existence. He hung up the phone, the silence of the cabin no longer oppressive but peaceful, a sanctuary where he could finally process the grief, the hope, the profound transformation he had undergone. He looked at the empty locket on his desk, not with the agonizing pain of loss, but with a quiet remembrance, a testament to the love he had for his son, a love that was now being channeled into the protection of the wild. The forest outside was a symphony of sounds, the rustle of leaves, the call of a distant owl, the steady, reassuring pulse of the mountain, a soundscape that he was finally a part of the interconnected web of life he was sworn to protect. He knew that the threat of the loggers, the fear of the unknown would always be there, but he was no longer afraid, for he had found the strength to fight, the courage to protect, the wisdom to let go. The lessons he had learned from the wolf, from the mountain, from the confrontation, were etched into his soul, a guide for the journey ahead, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. He looked at the logbook, the final entry, marking the release of the wolf, a story that was now complete, a testament to the power of care, of trust, of the profound wordless bond that can exist between man and beast. He felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey, for the challenges, for the profound transformation he had undergone, a journey that had led him to a place of peace, of understanding, of purpose. The forest was his home, the wolf his partner, the mountain his sanctuary, a life that was finally unequivocally his own, a life that was worth living, worth protecting, worth sharing. He stepped out onto the porch, the air crisp and clean, the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky, a sense of wonder and awe filling him, a feeling of being alive, of being connected, of being a guardian of the wild. The ultimate question, he realized, was not whether he could change the past, but whether he could find the courage to live in the present, to protect the future, to cherish the moments he was given, a question that he was now prepared to answer with his life. He looked toward the summit, hearing the last echo of the howl, a reminder of the wild that was both within him and around him, a testament to the enduring power of nature, a power that he was now committed to honoring, protecting, and celebrating, a guardian of the wild. Who are the shadows in your life? The loyal souls who have earned your protection, and more importantly, whose lives are you enriching with your own fierce, unconditional love? What unexpected friendship or bond has surprised you with its strength over the years? How do you show loyalty to those who matter most in your life? Share your story in the comments below. Subscribe to keep the spirit of conservation alive, and never forget that sometimes the greatest healing begins the moment we decide to be the person someone else needs.